Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. This episode is the beginning of our summer series about belonging outside belonging. I'm your MC tonight, Rach.
And I'm your MC, Rich. Tonight we are joined by our guest, Avery Alder. Hey, Avery, how are you?
I'm doing good, thanks. It's been an interesting couple of weeks trying to focus on school or game design at all. And so it feels good and weird to be sitting down to talk about games and to be stepping away from kind of watching current events and news unfold.
I hear you. The Belonging Outside Belonging summer series is something that Rach and I have been talking about doing for a while, and Avery was gracious enough to make some time to be on with us because really it started from her genius in game design. So we're going to juggle up our normal segments. It's been a few years now. We're doing something special for this summer series. So let's skip on over here and enter the segment called
Spend a Token.
Avery, tell us a little bit about Askew, which was the first Belonging Outside Belonging game. Like, where did it come from? You know, we had this Apocalypse World thing. You've done Monster Hearts at that point. And then all of a sudden you had this idea for Askew. So tell us a little bit about the germination and what inspired you to create the game.
So I started playing Apocalypse World when it was in the preview edition. So there have been books that have been made and sold kind of in a limited format at conventions and things like that, but it hadn't done its like official release. So I'd been involved in Apocalypse World for a few years. At that point, I'd already designed and published Monster Hearts. And at that point, all of my Apocalypse World-oriented gaming had happened, at conventions and with other kind of established role players. And so sitting down and playing, like a full 4-hour session and engaging with that full kind of rule set felt really normal, comfortable. In terms of like how crunchy that system was, it was well within like the regular spectrum of crunchiness of indie games that I was playing at conventions. But then a shift happened around 2013 where I started co-organizing a weekly drop-in role-playing game night. It started out once a week, and I think it shifted to once a month. So me and about 3 or 4 other co-organizers were putting this on. It took place at small independent cafes around Vancouver, and it was really just designed to be like a 3.5-hour meetup, sit down, play games, and we were really targeting people who are totally new to role-playing games, and especially people in the queer community. Yeah, Apocalypse World was one of the games that was on my shelf that I reached for to play with new players, especially to play with like people in the queer punk community, because I feel like a lot of the premise is really compelling, really speaks to that community. But what I was finding was that trying to sit down and with someone who's totally new to role-playing games, be like, okay, we're just going to in 3 hours play Apocalypse World. I found myself like really hitting up against my limits as a facilitator. There was a bit too much density in the rules set. And part of that was that the design of the playbooks of Apocalypse World came across to totally new players as, I think, more intimidating and rules intense than they actually were. A gun is plus loud, plus messy, 2 harm AP, or something like that. And that's really baffling to someone who isn't familiar with the role-playing game's standard set of acronyms and signifiers. And so I found myself hitting up against, like, there's slightly too much crunch in this game. There's slightly too much obscurity or like arcane ways of indicating information. And it's not quite right for this group. So originally Askew came out of a desire to run something Apocalypse World-esque for this drop-in, queer-oriented, new-to-role-playing games community meetup group. And then the more I worked on it, the more I drifted Apocalypse World in the direction that I was most excited to see it move in. Like, I was more excited about exploring, like, how does a community navigate its own, like, fuck-ups and scarcities, and less interested in the shooting people from motorcycles in the wasteland. And Apocalypse World, like, totally, like, it travels that spectrum in terms of what you can do with that storytelling. And so I just kind of shifted the window to be more about intra-community drama, more about queer relationships and fallout, and more about how we make individual identities within the rubble of a collapsing society. And in terms of kind of what the apocalypse means, I wanted it to be something that was far more immediate. listen, society has already been crumbling for a long time. And so this isn't 50 years later. This is like tomorrow, 20 years later, 10 years later. This is something that's like we're already seeing, and we're just extending it to its logical conclusions. Like, what happens if society continues to crumble and people continue to fall out of its margins?
So you addressed what inspired the creation of Dream Askew through Apocalypse World, but what were your design goals, mechanically speaking?
So there's a few. To be really accessible and welcoming to first-time role players was a design goal. To have a greater emphasis on the texture of community. And that shows up in both the community worksheet that's at the center of the table and also how everyone kind of contributes to different setting elements. So it's a little bit less of like a my character oriented game and more of like a my character embedded within community type of game. And then my other design goal was to have it be MC-less and dice-less.
And the MC-less and dice-less is to further push the easy to pick up for new role players kind of thing?
I think in a lot of ways, yeah. Part of it was that when I was running drop-in community things, I noticed that games that didn't have an MC had just like a really different power dynamic at the table than games with an MC or with a GM. With a group that is built of a lot of established role players, I think that power imbalance is less significant. But when you sit down to do an activity and someone's like, welcome to my event that I'm running. This is my game that I am introducing you to. And also, I am the one who controls most of the characters. And also, no, you're not allowed to narrate that kind of thing. That's my job. You're only allowed to narrate what your one character does. Like, just all of those things stacked on top of each other, it's a strange power differential. And so I really wanted to just create something that was more like, this is something that we're collaboratively doing together. And there's still a facilitator. The person who's bringing the game to the table is still taking a more active hand in leading by example, usually. But it's a bit more egalitarian, collaborative, and kind of transparent.
That's really interesting because it hadn't occurred to me with Apocalypse World being as intimidating and aggressive towards the player that also having an MC would put another layer of intimidation on especially a new player sitting down to their first role-playing game.
Yeah, this was something that I noticed in Story Games Seattle in their meetups, is that I think at one point they even had a no games with GMs rule. And it really shifted how people approached the space, especially as new players.
I can imagine.
I hear what you're saying, Avery, about that power dynamic. How would one handle if a person has, say, watched Critical Role and they see so-and-so just place their one character and now, no, you're this character and a community and this other thing and you're kind of doing that GM thing a little bit. And is there any intimidation factor there?
Yeah, I think it can be intimidating. I think, this game, compared to, like, say, Apocalypse World, it trades in some types of complexity and difficulty for different ones. And it is still a complex and challenging game. It asks every single player to think structurally and to do world building and to shift between multiple roles. And that can be totally demanding for people. For some people, the fact that there's no math involved, there's no numbers involved, there's no acronyms to try and memorize, like, that makes it more accessible. But to others, like, there's a higher degree of shared ownership of the setting and plot that makes it less accessible. So different things work for different people. One of the things that I did in the design and that I tried to pay attention to in the design is there's no point at which a new player is like spotlighted in like now it is your turn to frame a scene. Now you are responsible for leading the game. Everyone has setting elements, but some of them don't really come up. And if they do come up, it's pretty easy to there's mechanics for trading them away. And so I tried to make the system, give everyone shared ownership, give everyone shared narrative authority, but also not put people on the spot. Because that's definitely something that I noticed in games that are like, okay, scene 2 is framed by player 2. Scene 3 is framed by player 3. Like, that can really cause people to like choke up or freeze up, especially if it's their first time.
Avery, you revised Dream Askew a couple of years ago. Why?
I put out the prototype edition, I guess, in December 2013, January 2014. At the time, I was like, great, it's done. I've released it. It's kind of like, it's 3 pages of rules. It's a few pages of printouts, and it's good to go. I would have never returned to it and kind of turned it into like a published product probably if it weren't for Benjamin Rosenbaum. And he came along a few years later and said, I've been working on this project, this Apocalypse World hack called Shtetl World, about autonomous Jewish communities in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the project has gotten sprawling and almost out of hand. And then I came across Dream Askew and I realized that I wanted to do something like that. And so we started talking about that, and that game of his became Dream Apart. And the more we talked about it, the more it helped clarify for me what I had wanted to do with Dream Askew in the first place. And the more that Ben worked on his game, the more I saw like, oh, that mechanic is really interesting. And that mechanic actually gets at the heart of what this type of play is supposed to be. And in the prototype version that I released in 2013 of Dream Askew, queerness is a lot more of an aesthetic project, whereas in the finished game, queerness is a set of community relationships. And a lot of that transformation happened because of new mechanics that Benjamin introduced. So choose 2 key relationships that you have with other NPCs in the community. Like that mechanic comes from Dream Apart. The community worksheet came from the interaction between our 2 game ideas and like, how do we build these settings on the fly in ways that are unique to each of our storytelling backdrops?
Oh, that's so cool.
And so, yeah, a lot of the elements, the relational, community-oriented elements of the game weren't there or weren't fully realized in the original version. And they only came to be through kind of that dynamic back and forth design dialogue between Dream Askew and Dream Apart. And that's why ultimately they were released as 2 games within one book that share like a core set of rules, because they don't just happen to share the same system, but they grew alongside each other.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Avery.
Yeah, I actually I gave a talk at a small convention called Practice about how those 2 games were kind of co-developed, and it's on YouTube. It's called Designing in Dialogue with Other Games, and so if it would be interesting for any listeners to hear kind of a more in-depth unpacking of that story, that development story. It's about an hour long. I think it's my favorite talk that I put together, and so it's easy to find.
You can find a link to that talk in our show notes, so go check back over there and then come back and finish listening to the episode. Our next segment is You Also Play As The, where Avery will discuss Dream Askew and get into the setting and what it's about. You also play as the... So, Avery, what is Dream Askew about?
Yeah, I guess I didn't actually cover that when I dove into what inspired it. So Dream Askew is a game where you play as members of a queer enclave. So you are queer people struggling to make it in a world that is collapsing. So it's a post-apocalyptic game, or maybe it's a mid-apocalyptic game is probably a better description. And one of the conceits of the setting is that the collapse of civilization, it's not going to be a big bang where suddenly everything collapses all at once. That's not how structural change usually happens. It's going to be a process. And it's been a process that's been happening for some communities for hundreds of years. For some communities, it's been happening for several years. For some communities, it's going to start happening really soon. And so one of these setting conceits is that in the place where you live, queer people have fallen from good society, and they're living in the rubble that remains. And so you're members of a queer community. Civilization is crumbling. You've fallen out of its margins. There are strange psychic happenings going on in the world. Borrowing from Apocalypse World, there is a psychic maelstrom. It's just outside of our perception and we don't understand it, but it symbolizes kind of collective trauma, collective yearning, both possibility and the void. And so it's about navigating relationships, navigating imbalances in power, navigating kind of asymmetrical relationships to community leadership. And yeah, it's a diceless, MC-less game about what it means to be in a community that is trying to piece together scraps.
Diceless. Wow, GM-less. These concepts are awesome. Tell me a little bit more about those mechanics. What mechanics are different from Apocalypse World other than you took away my 2d6?
Yeah, so I took away the 2d6. Apocalypse World has this dice mechanic where there's 3 brackets. right? There's a 6 or lower, which is like a complicated, messy screw up of some type. There's that 7 to 9, which is the partial success, mixed results, trade-offs. And then there's that 10 plus of like, wow, your character just like glows in this moment. They're so capable, they're empowered, they're doing like cool shit. Dream Askew preserves kind of those 3 brackets, and it divides them into weak moves, normal moves, and strong moves. And so a normal move is one you can just do at any time, and it's analogous in a lot of ways to that 7 to 9. So we see your character just acting human, doing the things that they do in their regular day, exercising power, and acting in ways that leave themselves still vulnerable. There's also weak moves, and these are moments where we see your character as flawed, as fallible, making mistakes, foreshadowing future consequences. And whenever you make a weak move, you take a token. And then in order to make a strong move, you spend a token. And strong moves they're moves where you see your character realizing their full potential, acting with full empowerment, getting the goods, getting the results they're looking for. And so in order to see your character excelling and triumphing and doing cool, powerful stuff, we also need to see them struggling and screwing up and trying to figure themselves out. And so we get that kind of that analogy to the 6 or lower, 7 to 9, 10 plus bracket. And we also get this story tempo where we see your lows and then we see your highs, which I think is just, that's something that's baked into good storytelling. And so to maybe kind of ground that a little bit, one of the 6 character types in the game is the Stitcher, who's kind of the medic and tinkerer, the person who repairs like broken bodies as well as broken bicycles. And one of their regular moves is head out to scavenge or barter for supplies. So that's just something you can do anytime. One of their weak moves is treat someone like a project instead of a person. So this is a moment where we see they're being real Stitcher-like, but they're doing it in a way that like reveals their flaws. And one of their strong moves is to have everything required to fix or make a thing right away with no compromises or sacrifices. And so these are kind of all tied to these same themes of being someone who mends, who repurposes, and who makes, but we see kind of their highs and lows.
What's your favorite move or mechanic in Dream Askew, and why?
So my favorite mechanic, and this is actually something we're going to explore, I think, later in the podcast, is part of the community worksheet. So after you've created your characters and you've kind of fleshed out a bit of the wider setting, you sit down and you do this community worksheet called Welcome to the Enclave that helps you to define the community that these characters are a part of. And one of the things you do during that worksheet is circle 3 things that are in conflict in the Enclave. And so you kind of create this triangular struggle at the heart of your community, like 3 forces. And because it's 3 forces and then because they're all interconnected, it's really hard to find an easy, tidy solution. It's potentially possible to broker peace between 2 factions within a community when they have diametrically opposed needs. But when you've got that triangular kind of thing, there's always someone left out. And so that, I find, can often be really driving in play. So as far as mechanics, that triangular conflict at the heart of the community is probably my favorite one. And in terms of individual character moves, so unlike Apocalypse World, they're not, roll a die, choose all these things. There's a single bullet point that acts as a narrative prompt.
Mm-hmm.
One of the 6 playbooks of the game is called the Tiger, and they are kind of like a gang leader in the community. Maybe, they're the people who patrol the boundaries of the community, or maybe they're people who flex their power within the community. It's not really, that gets defined through play. But I was thinking a lot about harm mechanics and how violence gets explored in role-playing games, and often it gets explored as this like really exciting, adventurous, heroic, epic struggle. And there's a HP and attacks and combat rounds in a lot of games. And even in Apocalypse World, things like the harm clock, it creates this pacing mechanism where violence feels like a game.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be really interesting. But I think it's also, especially in stories about community and how power gets used in community, it's important to recognize that violence is sometimes, it's not symmetrical. It's not a clash of equal forces. Like a lot of the time, violence is cruel and sudden and leaves people reeling. And so one of the things you do during that worksheet is circle 3 things that are in conflict in the Enclave. And so you kind of create this triangular conflict at the heart of your community. And One of the ways that's modeled is the tiger has a strong move. So you spend a token to do this move, but it's just kill someone. And there's no qualifications. There's no, this is an NPC. It's just like, you do have the power to do this. We're all acknowledging that, like, as a gang leader, this is something you can do. And how that move gets used or not used in play, I find really compelling. Even though it's something that, like, this character is theoretically built to do, and it's something the moment they have a token, could do at any time. Like, there's a lot of weight to that one. And seeing people dance around it, I think, is often really interesting at the table.
The tiger is very evocative to me, and I don't want to make assumptions of players and the different archetypes they end up playing, but I find when I've brought Dream Askew to the table, there's a certain type of player that does gravitate towards the tiger, and they're not always the type of player who would be the most comfortable in a game about community. But then seeing them explore the tools and explore that space is always fascinating to me.
Yeah, one of the things that I don't name really explicitly in the book necessarily, but that I think of as really, like, important to Dream Askew is that every playbook has a different kind of power. And all those different types of power potentially can be used for the good of the community and potentially can be used for the harm of the community. Which way that will go is kind of something that you explore and define through play. And so for the tiger, like, physical violence and intimidation, like, you can use that to protect your community, and you can also use it to, like, harm that community from the inside out. And that one's, like, really explicit and obvious, but the other playbooks have that parallel kind of power. You know, the ability to influence people, the ability to give or withhold resources. Like, yeah, it's baked in different ways into each of the playbooks.
No dice, no masters.
In No Dice, No Masters, we get a little bit of actual play, a demonstration of some aspect of the game that our designer wants to highlight. This is Avery's AP, and I'm just going to hand it over to her and let her take it away.
Awesome. What I thought was maybe most distinctive about the setup of this game as compared to other Powered by the Apocalypse type games is the community worksheet element. And so where this comes in is we sit down, we create our individual characters, we customize the broader setting elements, and then at this point we have this enclave worksheet. So this defines, like, our immediate community that we live in as characters. We talked a little bit beforehand about creating some characters to bring to this enclave worksheet. So in this example of play, I am playing a torch, and my name is Always. A torch is a spiritual leader in the community, potentially more of a cult leader. I think Always is, like, her key belief that she's bringing to this community is that we have always been living through the end times. We have always been living through the great collapse. And what's happening now isn't a bad thing. We're breaking the chains of illusion. And so that's the character that I'm bringing into play. Rich, what about you?
Well, I'm playing a tiger. The tiger is a wicked, fierce individual. Their power is social, violent, and hard-won, and we already know about one of their moves. I imagine that my tiger, who goes by the name of Domino, has lost several members of their community and just decided that they have the strength to keep hold of what's precious and important, and hey, the community will benefit too.
And Rach?
I am playing Proper, who is a hawker. Hawkers are the business people of the Enclave, which is to say, if you need to get a hold of something that might be in my portfolio, I can help you out, for a price, of course.
We know that we're part of a queer enclave that has fallen out of the margins of society. We're making a go of it. So potentially we are living, like, in the rubble. Potentially we are living without electricity. Potentially we are living without jobs or money or government oversight of any type. But we're going to define a little bit more right now through this enclave worksheet. So the first part of this is to circle 3 to 5 visuals. And so these are kind of like terrain elements or kind of iconic landscape features that serve as the backdrop of our game. And so the list is long. I won't read out the whole thing, but it starts with an abandoned complex, individual homes, shanties and tents, a bustling market, overgrowth, glass and concrete. And it continues, and towards the end, we see raging parties, piles of trash, eerie warning signs, running water, repurposed plastics, and coarse fibers. And so we've all got the full list in front of us, and maybe each of us can, in turn, name one of the visuals that kind of jumps out to us.
I'll go first. Let's go with an abandoned complex.
Awesome. And do you have an image in your head of what the abandoned complex looks like already?
Yeah, I imagine it's a complex that was, I would say, like a 1970s, 1980s multiple entertainment center. Really thinking of Omni Complex in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where CNN was. There's an ice skating rink. There was a sporting arena. There was a little theme park at one point, and with an attached office tower.
I'm interested in a train station. I think that's fascinating and interesting to me. Crisscross tracks that dot across the landscape by this complex.
Awesome. That's great. Okay, so one of the things that I immediately imagine then is that we have the potential for this abandoned complex, because it is like on a train station, to be more remote than we might otherwise imagine. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be plunked down right in the middle of like an active urban center. I know that in kind of Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, along SkyTrain stations, giant casino complexes or apartment complexes would kind of like pop up at a SkyTrain station in hopes that a bigger center would grow around them. Because like all of a sudden the otherwise cheap land is potentially like skyrocketing in value because there's rapid transit access. And so potentially that's one of the ways that abandoned complex and train station kind of gel together.
Nice. I really like that.
For my one, I think piles of trash. Like a lot of it probably just like garbage men stopped clearing the area, or like municipal workers stopped clearing garbage. And so like street garbage is just like piling up around garbage cans. Waste collection stopped happening, so big like black plastic bags are just kind of like piled on the street and left there. But then also potentially like nearby like industrial sites have just dumped trailers full of whatever byproducts come out of their processes. Just everywhere kind of around the area, just giant piles of like trash. Some of it pretty fresh and rank, but a lot of it's been there long enough now that it's lost a lot of its smell. It's lost a lot of its significance. We don't even notice anymore that we're like hopping over industrial waste to get to our ice rink or a snow cone station.
That's a nice juxtaposition of imagery.
Does either of you have like one more that jumps out that would really like add that final dimension to this setting?
I really want to toss out the ocean. Maybe this was some oceanside resort or place that was abandoned. It works into the idea of being along the train lines and being off on our own. Like, people would come out to visit us, but now we're just a dumping ground by like endless water on the horizon.
Nice.
Awesome. Is there a name for this train station entertainment complex by the water?
Rich, you got a name?
I'm terrible at this. Neptune's Playground?
Oh my goodness. Yes. Okay, so Neptune's Playground. Do we still call it that?
Probably not, although I'm looking at the next piece of some conflicts that could lead to it being called just the playground.
Okay, yeah. So Neptune's Playground, informally referred to by a lot of community members just as the playground.
You cool with that, Rach?
Yeah, no, I also want there to be an NPC named Neptune that took their name from Neptune's Playground.
Absolutely, yeah. Someone like a self-appointed mayor figure.
Yes.
So the next step of this worksheet, if we were playing this in person as we were talking about this stuff, we'd be sketching a map on the other side of the worksheet. But we're obviously not able to do that over a podcast. But the other stage of this worksheet is circle 3 things that are in conflict in the enclave. This list is slightly shorter. I'm just going to read out the list in full, and then each of us can pick one, and we'll figure out how they fit into a triangular dialogue or tension. Psychic privacy, gender abolition, goddess cults, religious customs, revolutionary fervor, racial identity, indigenous land rights, mutants, scarcity thinking, politics of the void, hedonism, the need for purity, party culture, barriers to access, food justice, women's spaces, the use of violence, trauma, the limitless possibilities of queer sex, known abusers, and desiring a return to society. So it's a weighty list, but out of those, does anything strike you as potentially at the heart of the playground?
Yeah, the reason I was leaning towards playground is the party culture, especially with the character who trucks in violence or the threat thereof, how they deal within and without a party culture conflict would be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it kind of grew up around the complex. It was just those people who were left behind that was still an aspect of the culture of the people who live there.
Party never ended.
I mean, I feel like that makes a lot of sense. The Neptune's playground probably has very large indoor and outdoor spaces designed for big gatherings. And it also explains, I think, it helps to explain the piles of trash. Like if we're just throwing raves all the time and people come from elsewhere and then just like dump their shit and we just kind of scoop it off to the side and then like start planning the next rave, like it's going to build up. Okay, so we've got party culture. Rach, does one of those speak to you?
Politics of the void stands out.
Okay. Do you know what that means yet?
I think the void is what's left over after the apocalypse has rolled through. And the title, The Politics of the Void, is kind of a catch-all term that people are using for new style politics after the fall of society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think that the last one is women's spaces. And I think that the fact that we have this, we're entering into this era of the politics of the void, we're having these constant parties, and I imagine that there's probably not a great deal of effort put in by the whole community into like screening who comes, figuring out where they're coming from, figuring out what's being brought in. And potentially this gives rise to maybe several groups that are really concerned about like gender-based violence, like what is happening at these parties, who's kept safe, whose priorities are given value. And so I think that there's like potentially both just like a broader like community conversation about like how do we keep people safe at these parties, and then there's also a really second wave militant separatist leaning faction that is emerging within the community that is very like, we need to strip men of leadership positions, we need to keep women safe, we need to seize the resources of the community, reallocate space, we need major structural overhaul to keep our sisters safe. How does that feel? Does that fit with the playground?
I think that conflict is interesting and really meaty. It definitely puts the tiger Domino in both of those two aspects of the enclave, because they're going to have to negotiate how things happen based on the way of what they want, of course, because they're the tiger and they know what's best.
But also, what if people want to buy your services?
The parties go down.
But are your services more worthy of the parties, or are they worthy of protecting these spaces for various groups that want to meet?
It's true. If people are hurt, they aren't going to be buying anything from you.
How does Proper, the hawker, position themselves within kind of the dynamics of this community?
They want to see themselves as being nonpartisan and open to everyone within the enclave, but knows inside that that's probably not a position that they can hold on to forever. And I think the politics in particular do make it so that if you're leaning in favor of one side of the situation, you're not going to be seen in a positive light by the other.
Yeah, and I think Always has stoked a lot of antagonism within the community, especially targeted at Neptune for being like, life can just be a never-ending party. Who needs accountability when you can have another rave? But also I think she's like really frustrated with Domino for being like an enforcer who isn't 100% about defending women's spaces. And I think potentially also like there's a non-binary community clashes with radical second wave analysis thing going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know how the politics of the void and the party culture, what's the tension between those two forces?
If I were to speculate an idea of where that tension is coming from, I think it's the complexity of we want to have a space within this new world where we can have a good time, but I think the party culture overlooks any deep thought or wanting to take responsibility for the current situation. And that's really what the politics of the void are all about. Like, now that everything else is burned down, we need to take ownership of something and rebuild it. But if we're always partying, that's not going to happen.
And the party culture's thought is that, like, this work is that really productive? We've got all that we need for the parties. We'll just change the structure of how we relate to each other. Who says that this progress that you want is actually progress, or is it your progress?
So there's kind of this tension between like joy and accountability, between like structural power and individual choice, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's the community worksheet process. If we were playing a full session, what we'd do is we'd continue to kind of spitball and ask questions of one another until we got to a point where it was obvious that we were going to have a scene. And there's some prompts in the character sheets that help get people to that first scene. We've kind of entered into the stage of the game called idle dreaming. And really that's just like speculating. It's speculative world building. It's bouncing ideas off of one another. It's going, oh yeah. And then that would mean that we also have this going on in our community until a question emerges or like a meaty tension emerges that you want to unpack more richly. And that segues into framing a scene and exploring the dialogue that emerges there.
Oh man, I want to idly dream right now.
I think you can stop, right? That's not always a choice. Avery, thank you so much for coming on Plus One Forward and sharing with us about Belonging Outside Belonging to kick off the series, and Dream Askew and the history, and giving us a taste of it as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to hear the episodes that follow this one as well. And I feel like I haven't actually sat down with every game that you'll be showcasing necessarily. So I'm excited to see what emerges in the dialogue.
Well, it'll be an exciting couple of weeks around here. Avery, if our listeners want to follow more of your work and see what's up and coming for you, where can they find you online?
So my website is buriedwithoutceremony.com. Buried Without Ceremony is kind of the label that I release my work under. And I also am pretty active on Twitter, and my account there is @LackingCeremony.
Cool. Thanks again, Avery. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Drowning Attitude. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Hi listeners, we want to let you know that Brindlewood Bay is now available on DriveThruRPG. Brindlewood Bay is a role-playing game about a group of elderly women, members of the local Murder Mavens Mystery Book Club, who frequently find themselves investigating and solving real-life murder mysteries. They become increasingly aware that there are supernatural forces that connect the cases they are working on, and in particular, a cult dedicated to the dark, monstrous aspect of the goddess Persephone will come to vex them. Brindlewood Bay is a cozy crime drama mashed up with Lovecraftian horror. It's Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we think you're going to love it. Your download from DriveThru includes the rulebook for Brindlewood Bay, including a version for easy booklet printing, play aids such as the character sheet and dark conspiracy sheet, and 5 mysteries: Dad Overboard, All Hallows Scream, The Great Brindlewood Bay Bake-Off, Jingle Bell Shock, and A Murder Most Mucky. We'll be releasing 10 more mysteries over the next few months. Some of these mysteries will be featured in the Codex magazine, and others will be part of a standalone mystery collection coming out in late summer 2020. The first of the new mysteries, Exit Stage Death, will be out this month in Codex Yellow 2, available through the Gauntlet Patreon. So be sure to check out Brindlewood Bay on DriveThruRPG. We'll include a link in the show notes. Thanks.